Hey, I'm Adam Nitti, and you are watching for BassPlayersOnly.com.
Hi everyone, John Liebman here. You're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com. We're coming to you today from Philadelphia on location at Gerald Veasley's 2019 Bass Boot Camp with our old friend, our good friend, Adam Nitti. How you doing, Adam?
I'm doing great, Excited to be here once again, and thanks for having me.
It's always good to see you. We did an interview. You were one of the very first interviews ever on for BassPlayersOnly.com. I was just looking at that. It was October 12th, I think, 2009. And then we did one at Summer NAMM in 2014. So I guess we're on about a 5-year recurring schedule. Let's not wait another 5 years because you always have something to talk about.
We should change that schedule.
Yes, let's accelerate that. But the first time I think you were excited about the Liminal CD release, and then the second time you were talking about Not of This World.
Correct, yeah.
And I know you're busy in the studio and you're also busy performing and doing a lot of stuff. Kenny Loggins is a name that comes to mind. So why don't we start there? You are the bass player for Kenny Loggins Band. Tell me about that gig, because I interviewed your predecessor, Shem von Schreck,
Yes.
when they came through Michigan a few years ago. But fill us up to date, bring us up to date, and fill us in.
So yeah, the gig came about. It started out as a subbing situation, and
Something for Shem?
yeah, subbing for Shem originally, and I've got one of my best friends is the guitar player for Kenny, the lead guitarist named Scott Bernard. He's been with Kenny about 10 years, and I also knew a former keyboard player named Scott Sheriff, who I did a lot of touring with in the past, with Stephen Curtis Chapman and some other artists. So I knew some people in the gene pool already, which really worked to my advantage in allowing me to kind of get into the conversation when there was a need for a sub. So it's a really fun gig. Started off as a thing that was a little bit intimidating. Kenny's music is not your typical easy 3-4 chord pop type tunes. You know, the arranging is really interesting. The harmony is really interesting. The bass playing on the music historically is incredible. The late George Hawkins, unfortunately, we lost him recently, but huge influence on me in listening to Kenny's stuff originally. Nathan East is on a lot of that stuff. I mean, you look at those older records, and it's a who's who of musicians, and so being able to play from the songbook of that legacy is super exciting, because the age I'm at and the music I was listening to coming up, I saw a lot of the evolution, sort of transpire with those hits throughout especially like the 80s and the 90s. So I was a fan always. And then now getting to play some of these legendary tunes with the guy who wrote them and was the brain behind this stuff, it's really fun. And the gig is great, not only from a bass playing standpoint, but I get to use my background vocal chops, which is something that not a lot of people realize that I do. But most of the bands that I was in coming up in Atlanta, I was having to sing a lot. So that was a requirement of this gig. And so
I didn't know that until I asked you about it the other day, because when I was talking to Shem, he says, "Oh, you got to play electric, you got to sing, you got to play keyboards," and I was surprised to hear that you did that just because of your releases and all the stuff that I've always thought of in association with you. In that context, I never knew you were a singer.
Yeah, so it's great. It's a challenge and it's fun. The gig it's not the same every night, even if the set list is. There's a lot of interaction on stage. So yeah, I mean, it's a blessing to be a part of it, and we stay busy enough to work, but not busy enough to get burned out. It's a reasonable schedule. Still leaves me time to do my music and do events like this bass boot camp that we're here enjoying. So yeah, I'm just very, very grateful.
Well, great. I remember when that time that Shem did invite me out, and I got to sit through the sound check, and I remember Kenny being very meticulous in the sound check, but in a very friendly, courteous, gentlemanly way. Is that your experience with him?
Yeah, Kenny is I don't know how else to say it. You know, he really is like a musician's musician. He's a deep listener. You know, to the point of wanting to dissect things. Sometimes take a lot of time with it. You know, at sound check, stuff that we've been playing for literally years. You know, certain modified arrangements. We'll be at sound check, and Kenny will show up and decide, hey, let's try this tonight. And, he'll like sing me a bass part, sing the specific part that he wants me to try, or, go to the drummer and say, hey, let's try this feel, instead I'm going to start this song out a little bit different. So you never know what's going to happen. There's kind of like there's a base level agenda, but sometimes there's a surprise, thrown in there. So it keeps it fun and interesting.
That's funny. At the opposite end of the spectrum, my friend Matt Bissonette, Detroit boy, he used to play with Elton John. And I said, well, can we get together like between the sound check and the show? He says, Elton doesn't do sound checks. We just show up and do it. So one end of the spectrum to the other. Before we get off, Kenny, I wanted to talk a little bit more about your keyboard requirements in that gig. I was reading the interview we did, the first one in 2009. I think you said your grandfather used to show you some stuff on the keyboard, so your first introduction to music was actually as a piano player, right? Yeah. So what is the piano requirement like in the Kenny Loggins gig?
Well, it's interesting. It's actually changed some from when I first started. Initially, the object was to come in and cover both the keyboard and the bass chair, and which was kind of how when I see the band in its contemporary state, that's kind of how they were doing it. They were traveling.
Excuse me. When you say keyboard, though, do you mean bass keyboard?
No, I mean like actual like piano parts or synth parts, and that's what I observed. So
you need to use both hands.
Yeah. And that's what I spent a lot of time rehearsing some specific songs, but it morphed into kind of a different situation when I was subbing at the beginning, before doing the gig regularly. There was basically two different versions of the band that were working. One was a 4-piece version where Shem was doubling on keyboards and bass, and of course doing his vocal parts. And Shem is a super talented guy. He does all of those roles very, very well. But at the time I was subbing, there was also a 5-piece version of the band where there was a separate keyboard player and bass player. So even though that was kind of talked about at the beginning, I think because they were already sort of operating in those two different entities, I think Kenny chose different arrangements of the band based on what the gigs were, or maybe what the budgets were and things like that. I don't know all of the behind the scenes details for that, but what started out as a requirement for me to be on keyboards, at the same time as bass for all the shows, over time it kind of just turned into a thing where you want a direction of still using a separate keyboard player. So now the format of the band's a little bit different than it was then, because now we have a dedicated keyboard player. I'm doing the dedicated bass, and we have now a second guitar player, like a second rhythm guitar player, is also singing. So it's changed, and I spent a lot of time working on the keyboard parts, but I don't regret any of it, because it kind of forced me to get my chops back together. And because I started out, my first formal training was on classical piano, right. And so I was taking lessons at 8 and 9 years old on classical piano. The first bit of reading or exercises, chops, any of that stuff was all based around the piano. I didn't start playing bass until I was 13 or 14 years old. So it's in my DNA, from an early age, but I haven't had to rely on it in years, because I've just done my writing on keyboards. I haven't had to do any performances with it. It's just been kind of, in the background in my studio. So
what happens to the low end though when you're on keyboard? You supply that via the keyboard?
Well, that's a great question. When I first started playing bass, I was faced with that challenge. How am I going to answer this question? And those were the first times I ever actually worked on practicing executing, playing bass by tapping with my fretting hand and playing keyboards with my right hand, developing that independence. And at the time I was I was like, oh, this is going to be a cool shtick, because I was a huge Geddy Lee fan. I was in a Rush, and Geddy didn't only play bass; he had the keyboard thing. So I wanted to be like him, and I was trying to make all that stuff happen. So I had that experience, and that's what I planned on doing, coming into this situation. But at the end of the day, that ended up not being required. That may change in the future. You never know. But I need to stand at the ready. But
if Kenny's watching this interview, it might change.
Yeah. Kenny, if you decide to throw that on me, then I'm going to be ready for you. But
Let's talk more about you and your solo career, because you had, and I was telling you the other day when the previous, what's it called, Not of This World, came out, and you sent it to me. I put it on my iPod. I had gone down to Florida, where I lived for 6 years, so I thought I knew my way around pretty well, and I told my wife I'm going for a run. And I put on your album, and somehow I got lost. And I heard your album, and then I heard the whole album again, and then I heard the whole album again, because I was... Anyway, that's another story, not for this interview, getting off track. But
story.
Yeah. But anyway, you're working on another new album, a solo release. What can you tell us about it?
So, yeah, I didn't plan on my new record taking this long to do. You have ambition of recording a record every year or every other year, and it just kind of didn't happen that way this time around. But I've been working for a long time on just a different direction. I have 5 records out so far, and it's very much that contemporary instrumental jazz fusion type of thing, for lack of a better description. But this new record, I didn't want it to be instrumental, so been working with some really great singers, and I decided I want to do like an aggressive record that's like melding really cool stuff from the instrumental side of things with some really great melodies and some meaningful lyrics. So this is going to be different.
What about you? Are you singing on it?
I had plans of doing the vocals, and that may still happen, but the original vision of the record was to have several different singers on it. But it's kind of changing it's kind of turning more into like a band kind of identity record. So
that's a departure for you too, because you'd have one record with like 5 different drummers and different everybody.
Yeah, that's true. And this is now going the way of having the same people on all the tracks. So I've done some vocal roughs of my own, but there are singers out there way more qualified than I am and way more experienced than I am, and I think I may let them do what they do.
You have a title for the record?
I do, actually. The working title right now is "The World Is Loud."
Is that one of the titles of a tune also? Because I asked you, I think last time, and you said, well, one of the tunes also turns out to be often the title of the album.
That's been the tradition of my albums. I think every one of them has had a title track. Yeah, they have. And this is going to be no different, so there will be a title track. Okay. The World Is Loud. Unless that changes, that's the idea.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your gear.
So gear-wise, I'm so lucky to be aligned with some really great companies. Ibanez builds my basses. And it's a super exciting time for me because I have a brand new signature 5-string that just came out. It's the ANB 205, and it's...
Which string did you take off, the high C?
We took off the high C. Okay. So you can tune it E to C if you like. I tune mine B to G. But it's based around a 70s jazz or 70s J configuration. Yeah. But so it has a tone that's in that world, but it has the ergonomics of we've come to know and love from Ibanez, easy playability. But it's got some really unique things that really allow it to sort of stand out in the product line. We have a totally custom built preamp that I worked with Bartolini on. That it's a 9-volt active circuit, but it has this very special little Mojo passive tone buffer in the cavity, which allows the bass to take on a more passive sound and buffer some of the brightness. It's an ash body and maple neck, so it's inherently bright. This tames it or gets it to go even dark if you like. So
what color is it?
It is a transparent. They call it a trans wine burst. So it's this gorgeous red color, and you can see the wood grain through it. It's really nice. And then a maple fingerboard and black old school inlays on it.
Because you have that beautiful blue 6-string.
Yes, I like the reds and the blues.
I'm just a little surprised with all your technique and your tapping and your composing. Why would you think to take off the high C string? Because I know you use it a lot.
Well, I make most of my living on
Playing bass.
playing bass. So I'm playing 5-string instruments with virtually all of the live stuff I'm doing right now, and then I still play 4-string bass in a lot of studio contexts in Nashville. And there's certain tonal expectations, and places where certain instruments fit and certain ones don't. So I try to play. I have a lot of different tools for different jobs.
You really got to get your mind right for 4-string, 6-string, 5-string, making sure you know. And I'm sure you're used to that kind of thinking.
Well, again, it's one of those things of just kind of having the right tool for the job. But I'm again lucky to have some great tools. The amplifiers that I've been playing for years, Aguilar stuff, which they're always doing new things and staying kind of on the cutting edge of the technology. And I've been using their more than anything else lately. I've been using their super light series of gear, the SL series, and they have a brand new Tonehammer 700 head that weighs nothing. That I'm super excited. And then been using D'Addario strings for almost 2 decades now, and those are 3 companies that have been really, really supportive, and I just love the gear. It's been fortunate, great experience.
You won't go wrong with any of that stuff.
Yeah.
Hey, it's fun hanging out with you, and it's kind of interesting to travel without going to a different time zone. And I remember I think you're probably 1 hour off from home, but we hung out in Germany together, you and I.
Yes.
And you said, somebody told me that it takes about 1 day for every hour difference, and it's a 6-hour time change. I said, how long have you been here? You said 6 days. I said, when are you going home? Tomorrow. So you got to turn around.
Yeah.
I just thought of you when I thought of that story. It always makes me smile.
Yeah.
One last question for you, Adam. What would you be if you weren't a bass player? I mean, something outside of music.
I would love to be a race car driver professionally. That would be cool. I've done some amateur racing, and from a hobby level, but I've always been a motorsports geek, and I just those guys are like superheroes with skin and bone, just like the rest of us. They do amazing things, but I just love that. It's fun.
I did ask you that question in the last interview, and since it's been 5 years, I wanted to ask you again. That's the same answer you gave me, and Marcus Miller gave me that answer, and Ron Carter gave me that
Is that
answer.
right?
Yeah, so how about that?
Amazing.
Yes. All right, with the revved up Adam Nitti on location in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My first time in Philly, except in the airport one time. So I'm happy to be here at Gerald Veasley's Bass Boot Camp 2019. I'm John Liebman. You're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com.